Before you close this video, listen carefully, because something about the way you found these words tonight was not as random as you think. Maybe you were just lying there in the dark with your phone inches from your face, telling yourself you were only scrolling for a minute before trying to sleep again. Maybe your apartment feels unusually quiet tonight, the kind of quiet that almost presses against your chest. Or maybe you just got home after another 10-hour shift, sat in your car in the driveway, and couldn't bring yourself to walk inside yet because you're exhausted in a way sleep doesn't fix anymore. You've been carrying something heavy for a long time now, haven't you? Not the kind of pain people can immediately see, but the kind that slowly settles into your thoughts when nobody else is around. The kind that follows you into grocery stores, traffic lights, empty kitchens, and late-night drives with the radio turned low. And lately, something has felt different. Not better. Just different. Like the silence around your life has somehow become louder. You tried to ignore it at first. You told yourself it was stress. Burnout. Maybe you just needed a weekend off or a few good nights of sleep. But deep down, you know that's not all this is. Because there have been moments recently that felt strange in a way you can't explain. Little interruptions. A memory showing up out of nowhere. A song playing at the exact right moment. Waking up at 3:17 in the morning night after night for no reason. Seeing the same phrase over and over again until it starts feeling personal. And every time it happened, you brushed it off because part of you stopped believing anything meaningful could still reach you. That's what happens when someone spends too long feeling emotionally abandoned. You stop looking for signs because disappointment trains you not to expect them anymore. There was a time when you used to believe things would eventually work out. You used to pray with confidence. You used to think there was purpose behind delays and pain. But after enough unanswered questions, enough closed doors, enough nights wondering why everyone else seemed to move forward while your life stayed stuck, something inside you quietly started shutting down. Not dramatically. You still smiled around people. You still went to work. You still answered texts and paid bills and got through your routines. But internally, you began drifting. And the scariest part is that almost nobody noticed. That's why this moment feels different right now. Because even after all the disappointment, something inside you still paused when these words appeared. Something in you is still listening, even if you don't fully understand why yet. And maybe that's because the story you've been telling yourself about your life is incomplete. Maybe the silence was never proof you were forgotten. Maybe the things that fell apart recently were not random losses at all. Because sometimes what feels like distance is actually protection happening quietly before you can recognize it. And tonight, before you turn away from this moment like you've turned away from so many others lately, there is something you need to realize about the season you're in right now. You have been trying so hard to convince yourself that you are fine. That is what makes this season so exhausting. It is not only the pressure of life itself, it is the constant effort of pretending the pressure is not getting to you. Every morning starts almost the same now. The alarm goes off too early, your body already feels tired before your feet even touch the floor, and for a few seconds you just lie there staring at the ceiling trying to gather enough energy to begin another day that feels exactly like the one before it. You move through routines automatically now. Coffee growing cold beside you. Traffic lights blurring together during the drive to work. Small conversations with people who have no idea how distant you have felt lately from your own life. And somehow the hardest moments are not even the loud ones. They are the quiet ones. The moments when everything slows down just enough for your thoughts to catch up with you again. Standing alone in the kitchen after midnight. Folding laundry with the television running only for background noise. Sitting in a parking lot with the engine off because going home somehow feels heavier than staying still for 5 more minutes. You have noticed yourself becoming emotionally numb in ways that would have scared you a year ago. Things that used to matter deeply barely affect you now. Calls go unanswered longer. Messages stay unopened. Dreams you once fought for sit quietly in the back of your mind like old photographs collecting dust. And every once in a while you wonder when exactly that change happened. When did hope become something you stopped expecting? There was a moment recently, maybe only a few weeks ago, when you caught yourself staring out a window completely lost in thought while rain slid slowly down the glass, and for a second you realized how disconnected you had become from yourself. Not angry. Not broken. Just tired in a deeper way than you know how to explain to people. Because the truth is, part of you has quietly been grieving something you cannot fully name. Maybe it was the future you thought would happen by now. Maybe it was a relationship you believed would last. Maybe it was simply the version of yourself that used to feel certain life was leading somewhere meaningful. And what makes it harder is that nobody really sees this side of you. They see you functioning, showing up, smiling politely, paying your bills on time. But they do not see the silence you carry home with you every night. They do not hear the thoughts that start creeping in after midnight when the world finally gets quiet enough for doubt to speak louder. Lately you have even started wondering whether all the delays and disappointments actually meant something about you personally. Whether maybe you were overlooked somehow, forgotten somehow, left behind while everyone else kept moving forward. But there is something important you have not realized yet. The strange heaviness you feel lately did not begin when things started falling apart. It began when something inside you started waking up. That discomfort, that emotional tension, that sense that your old life no longer fits you the same way anymore, it is not random. Because sometimes before direction changes, everything familiar starts feeling strangely empty first. And the reason that matters more than you know is because some endings do not arrive to destroy your path. Some endings arrive to stop you from continuing down the wrong one. There was a time when you kept asking for signs everywhere you went. You searched for meaning in little things because you needed to believe your life was still connected to something greater than the confusion you were living through. You remember those nights, do not you? Sitting at the edge of your bed with your elbows on your knees, whispering quiet thoughts into the dark because you did not even know how to pray clearly anymore. You just wanted reassurance that you were not walking through all of this alone. At first you believed answers would come quickly. You thought maybe if you stayed patient long enough, things would eventually begin making sense again. But weeks turned into months. Then months turned into seasons. And slowly, without even noticing it happen, you stopped looking upward altogether. It was not rebellion. It was exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion changes people in quiet ways. You stop expecting good news because disappointment starts feeling more realistic than hope. You stop talking about your dreams because hearing yourself say them out loud only reminds you how far away they seem now. And eventually you begin carrying your pain privately because explaining it takes too much energy. There was one night not long ago when you drove around for nearly 40 minutes after work without any destination in mind. The streets were nearly empty, streetlights reflecting against the windshield while soft music played low through the speakers. You passed the same gas station twice without realizing it because your thoughts were somewhere else completely. You kept replaying everything that had changed over the last year. The opportunities that disappeared. The conversations that ended strangely. The people who slowly faded away without explanation. And underneath all of it was one question you never fully admitted out loud. Why does it feel like my life keeps closing in on me? That question followed you home that night. It sat with you while you microwaved leftovers you barely touched. It stayed there. While you scrolled through old photos on your phone, staring at versions of yourself that looked lighter somehow. Not happier exactly, but more certain. More alive. You could feel the difference immediately. Somewhere along the way you stopped feeling connected to your own future. That is what nobody talks about enough. Sometimes the hardest part of waiting is not the delay itself. It is watching yourself slowly lose emotional connection to the person you used to be. And lately, there have been moments where you wondered if your silence toward life had become permanent. Maybe that is why certain things have felt strangely personal recently. A phrase overheard at exactly the right moment. A memory surfacing for no reason while standing in line at a grocery store. A sudden feeling you should take a different road home even when logic says it does not matter. Little moments that seem too small to explain but too specific to ignore completely. You tell yourself it is coincidence because that feels easier than admitting something deeper may still be trying to reach you. But here is what you have not realized yet. The reason these moments keep interrupting your numbness is because part of you is not fully disconnected after all. Something inside you still responds when truth brushes against your spirit. Even now, after all the disappointment, there is still a quiet part of you that pauses when something feels meaningful. And that matters more than you understand right now because the season you are walking through is not only exposing your exhaustion. It is exposing the ways you began turning away from yourself long before you realized it. The strange thing is that life did not fall apart all at once. If it had, maybe you would have noticed sooner. Maybe you would have understood immediately that something deeper was happening beneath the surface of everything you were experiencing. But instead, it happened slowly, almost invisibly, piece by piece. One conversation changed its tone. One opportunity quietly disappeared. One relationship became distant without warning. And at first you kept telling yourself not to overthink it. People move on. Timing changes. Life gets complicated. That is what you said to yourself every time another door quietly closed in front of you. But after a while, even you could not ignore how unusual the pattern had become. There was always just enough hope to keep you emotionally invested before something shifted again. One week it felt like things were finally moving forward. The next week everything stalled without explanation. You started feeling as if your life existed in permanent almosts. Almost getting the call you were waiting for. Almost feeling close to someone again. Almost believing things would finally stabilize. But somehow every time you reached for certainty, it slipped through your hands again. One Friday evening you sat alone at a diner off the highway after work because you did not feel ready to go home yet. The place was nearly empty except for an older couple near the window and a tired waitress refilling coffee cups under dim yellow lights. You remember staring down at your phone, rereading an old message from someone you once thought would still be part of your life by now. It had been months since you talked regularly, but for some reason that night the silence between you suddenly felt heavier than usual. You wondered whether you should send another message. Whether maybe this time things would somehow be different. But something stopped you. Not fear exactly. Just a strange feeling deep in your chest telling you to leave it alone. You could not explain it, so you ignored it at first. Yet even after driving home, the feeling stayed with you. And over the next few days, little things kept happening that made it harder to dismiss. You heard information unexpectedly that changed how you viewed that entire relationship. Details you were never supposed to know. Truths that quietly exposed how much emotional damage would have followed if things had continued the way you wanted them to. That realization shook you more than you admitted to anyone. Because for the first time, you started wondering whether some of the things you lost were never truly safe for you to hold onto in the first place. That thought stayed in the back of your mind afterward. Quiet but persistent. And suddenly, other moments from the past year started looking different too. The job opportunity that disappeared at the last minute. The move that fell through unexpectedly. The plans that collapsed even after you worked so hard to hold everything together. What if not every closed door was rejection? What if some things ended because they were quietly leading you somewhere your spirit already knew was wrong for you, even if your emotions could not accept it yet? That is the part nobody prepares you for. Sometimes protection does not feel comforting when you are inside it. Sometimes it feels disappointing, confusing, even cruel. Especially when you cannot yet see what you are being protected from. And maybe that is why this season has felt so emotionally exhausting for you lately. Because part of your soul has been fighting against redirection while another part of you secretly knows you cannot keep becoming the version of yourself you were before everything started changing. What has been hurting you the most was never simply the waiting. It was the feeling that you were waiting alone. That is the part that slowly wore your spirit down over time. You could handle delays if you understood the reason behind them. You could survive disappointment if you knew it was leading somewhere meaningful. But uncertainty has a way of exhausting the human heart when it lasts too long. Especially when you keep watching other people move forward while your own life feels paused somewhere between who you used to be and who you are becoming. Lately it has felt like everyone around you has direction except you. People announce engagements, new homes, promotions, fresh beginnings. Meanwhile you have been sitting quietly with questions you cannot answer yet. Trying to stay hopeful while carrying disappointments nobody fully understands. Some nights you replay conversations in your head wondering what you could have done differently. Other nights you stare at the ceiling trying not to think at all because your thoughts have become too heavy to sort through anymore. There was a night recently when you pulled into your apartment complex after work and noticed every light in the building glowing warmly through the windows except yours. For a moment you just sat there gripping the steering wheel in silence. The loneliness hit you harder than usual that night. Not because you physically had nobody around you, but because emotionally you felt unseen in a way you could not explain. You thought about calling someone just to hear another voice, but then you remembered how many times lately you have started saying, "I am fine," before anyone even asks how you are doing. So instead you stayed in the car for nearly 20 minutes listening to rain tap softly against the windshield while your mind drifted through every disappointment you have tried not to feel fully. That was the moment you finally admitted something to yourself you had been avoiding for a long time. You are tired of pretending things do not affect you. Tired of acting strong every time life quietly breaks another expectation you carried. Tired of waiting for things that never seemed to arrive when you hoped they would. And maybe most of all, tired of trying to understand why certain prayers seem to disappear into silence. But what you still cannot fully see right now is that the silence itself has been changing you in ways that would not have happened any other way. Because somewhere beneath all this exhaustion, your dependence on external validation has slowly been breaking apart. The things you once believed would save you emotionally no longer hold the same power over your heart. Relationships. Status. Constant reassurance. Even the version of success you used to chase so desperately feels strangely hollow now. At first that realization frightened you because it felt like losing pieces of yourself. But what if it was actually the beginning of becoming more honest with yourself than you have ever been before? Sometimes the reason old desires stop satisfying you is because your spirit has already started moving towards something deeper long before your mind catches up. That is why this season feels so emotionally uncomfortable. You are grieving old expectations while quietly being prepared for a different kind of life entirely. And the hardest part is that preparation rarely feels inspiring. While it is happening, most of the time it just feels lonely. It feels like standing in the middle of your living room at 1 a.m. wondering why everything familiar suddenly feels emotionally distant. But there is a reason you keep sensing that something inside you is shifting even while everything around you remains uncertain. Because the version of yourself that once settled for surface-level comfort can no longer survive in the place your life is trying to lead you toward. You did not drift away from your old life all at once. It happened quietly, in ways that were almost impossible to notice at first. One day you realized certain conversations no longer energized you the way they used to. Places that once felt comforting suddenly felt emotionally crowded. Even the habits that helped you escape for a little while stopped giving you the relief they once did. And because none of these changes happened dramatically, you kept trying to force yourself back into a version of life that no longer fit who you were becoming. That has been part of the tension exhausting you lately. You have been trying to return emotionally to places your spirit already outgrew. There was a Saturday afternoon recently when you met up with people you had known for years. The restaurant was loud, everyone talking over each other while televisions flashed sports highlights across the walls. On the outside nothing was wrong. People laughed. Drinks arrived at the table. Stories bounced from one person to another. But halfway through the evening, you felt strangely disconnected sitting there. Like you were physically present but emotionally somewhere else entirely. You looked around the room wondering why something that used to feel normal suddenly felt empty. That feeling stayed with you long after you drove home that night. You parked outside your apartment, shut off the engine, and just sat there in the dark again listening to the ticking sound of the cooling motor. And for the first time in a long while, you stopped distracting yourself long enough to hear what your own thoughts had been trying to say underneath all the noise. You are changing. Not in the dramatic way movies portray transformation, but in the slow, uncomfortable way real life changes people from the inside out. The problem is that internal change often feels like loss before it feels like growth. That is why this season has felt so emotionally confusing. Part of you keeps grieving old versions of life while another part quietly understands you cannot go back to who you used to be anymore. And the more you resist that truth, the heavier everything feels. Lately you have noticed yourself pulling away from things without fully understanding why. You spend more time alone. You cancel plans more often. Certain environments leave you emotionally drained in ways they never did before. At first you worried something was wrong with you. You wondered if you were becoming distant, detached, maybe even emotionally cold. But what if this withdrawal is not emptiness at all? What if it is discernment slowly developing inside you? Because not every form of isolation is punishment. Sometimes people are pulled away from constant noise because clarity cannot reach them any other way. There have been moments recently where you almost felt guided away from certain situations before you even understood the reason. A delayed conversation. A canceled trip. A strange feeling telling you not to force something that looked perfect on paper. Your mind called it bad timing. But deeper down, something inside you kept whispering that forcing your way forward would only create more pain later. That inner tension has become impossible to ignore now. Especially at night when life finally becomes quiet enough for truth to surface again. And maybe that is why you keep feeling emotionally suspended between two versions of yourself lately. One part still wants familiar comfort. The other part already senses that staying the same would slowly destroy your peace. Because the truth you are only beginning to understand is that some people do not lose direction because they are abandoned. They lose direction because they are being redirected before they walk fully into something that was never meant to hold them. The hardest part about being redirected is that it rarely feels peaceful in the moment. Most of the time it feels confusing. It feels like standing in front of a closed door you prayed would open while trying to understand why your life keeps moving in directions you never planned for. That confusion has followed you for months now. Maybe longer. And deep down, you have been fighting two battles at the same time without even realizing it. One battle is external. Bills. Responsibilities. Delays. Uncertainty about where your future is heading. But the other battle is internal, and that one has been draining you far more deeply. Because part of you still wants answers that would allow you to emotionally return to the life you imagined for yourself before everything started changing. You still revisit certain memories more than you admit. You still wonder whether things could have worked if you had tried harder, waited longer, explained yourself differently. There are moments where your mind reaches backward automatically toward people, places, and plans that once felt safe to you. But every time you imagine stepping back into those old spaces now, something inside you tightens quietly. It is subtle, but it is there. A feeling that what once felt familiar no longer feels fully right anymore. A few nights ago you found yourself scrolling through old pictures again while sitting on your couch with only the kitchen light on. Hours had passed without you noticing. You stopped on one photo in particular and stared at it longer than the others. At first it made you miss who you were back then. But the longer you looked, the more something unexpected surfaced beneath the nostalgia. You realized how exhausted you already looked even during moments you once called happiness. How often you ignored your own intuition just to keep certain relationships alive. How many times you forced yourself to accept emotional crumbs because you were afraid of losing people completely. That realization unsettled you more than you expected because suddenly your memories stopped looking as simple as your loneliness had been painting them. And that is when another truth quietly began surfacing inside you. Not every loss in your life came to destroy you. Some things ended because your spirit could no longer survive pretending those environments were healthy for you. You simply did not recognize it at the time because loneliness has a way of making old pain look safer than unknown change. That is why you keep feeling emotionally pulled in opposite directions lately. One side of you still craves comfort and certainty. The other side senses that returning backward would cost you your peace. And maybe that explains why certain doors continue staying closed no matter how hard you try to reopen them. There have even been moments recently where opportunities disappeared so suddenly it almost felt intentional. Plans canceled at the last minute. Unexpected delays that frustrated you deeply in the moment. Strange timing that made no logical sense at all. But afterward, little pieces of truth kept surfacing that slowly revealed what you could not see before. You started noticing patterns. Conversations that exposed hidden motives. Situations that looked perfect externally but carried emotional heaviness underneath them. And for the first time, you began wondering whether your life was not falling apart randomly after all. Maybe something had been quietly interrupting your path before you walked too far into places that would have broken you slowly over time. That thought changes everything once it settles into your spirit. Because if some delays were actually protection, then the silence you feared may not have been abandonment at all. It may have been guidance appearing in forms painful enough to force you to finally pay attention. There is a reason this season has felt so different from every difficult period you survived before. In the past, when life became painful, you always knew what direction you wanted things to go. You had a clear idea of what outcome would finally make you feel safe again. But this time has been different because even the things you thought you wanted no longer feel completely right in your spirit anymore. That confusion has unsettled you deeply. You have spent months trying to figure out why certain desires suddenly feel heavy instead of exciting. Why opportunities that once looked perfect now leave you strangely uneasy. Why? Your intuition keeps interrupting plans your mind desperately wants to force forward anyway. And the more you ignore those feelings, the louder the emotional tension becomes. A few days ago, while driving home after another exhausting shift, you missed your usual exit without realizing it because your thoughts were somewhere else again. By the time you noticed, you were already several miles farther down the highway than normal. Frustrated, you pulled into a quiet gas station near the edge of town to clear your head. The place was almost empty except for an older man slowly wiping down the windows near the pumps while soft country music played faintly through an outdoor speaker. You remember standing there beside your car staring up at the dark sky, feeling emotionally overwhelmed in a way you could not fully explain. And then something unexpected happened. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a quiet realization settling into you so suddenly that you could not ignore it. You thought about all the things that had fallen apart recently, and for the first time, instead of only feeling rejected, you started seeing how close some of those situations came to leading you into deeper exhaustion than you already carried. The relationship that would have forced you to keep abandoning your own needs just to maintain peace. The opportunity that looked successful externally but would have consumed every remaining piece of emotional energy you had left. The plans you begged to work even though something inside you never felt calm about them from the beginning. And standing there under those fluorescent lights with cold air moving through the parking lot around you, you realized something that changed the way you saw your entire past year. Your life was not collapsing randomly. You were being redirected away from things your heart wanted but your spirit could not survive long term. That is why the silence became so intense. Because deep down, part of you already sensed the truth before your mind was ready to accept it. The delays were not there to punish you. They were there to interrupt paths that would have slowly destroyed your peace while convincing you they were saving you. And suddenly all those strange moments started connecting differently in your mind. The cancelled plans. The unanswered messages. The opportunities that disappeared at the last second. The people who drifted away right when you thought you needed them most. You called those moments abandonment because you only saw the loss they created. But what if they were actually protection arriving in forms painful enough to stop you from chasing things that were never aligned with who you were becoming? That realization does not erase the loneliness you felt. It does not suddenly make the waiting easy. But it changes something important inside you. Because once you begin understanding that not every closed door was meant to hurt you, you stop interpreting silence as proof that you were forgotten. And for the first time in a very long while, you begin sensing that maybe the strange tension surrounding your life lately has not been warning you that you are lost. Maybe it has been guiding you somewhere your old self would never have chosen willingly. Once that realization entered your mind, you could not fully return to seeing your life the same way anymore. Even though nothing around you changed overnight, something inside you quietly did. You started noticing details you overlooked before. Patterns that once seemed random suddenly carried weight. Moments you dismissed as coincidence began feeling strangely intentional. And the more aware you became, the more you realized how many times you were guided away from situations your emotions desperately wanted to hold on to. That awareness has been unsettling because it forces you to confront a difficult truth. Some of the things you begged to keep were slowly draining the life out of you long before they disappeared. The strange part is that your spirit often recognized it before your mind did. That is why certain environments left you exhausted for no obvious reason. Why some conversations made your chest feel heavy afterward even when nothing outwardly bad happened. Why you kept feeling restless every time you tried to force yourself back into old versions of your life. Your mind kept calling it anxiety, but deeper down there was another part of you quietly trying to protect you from continuing down paths that no longer matched who you were becoming. A few evenings ago you stopped at a grocery store after work just before closing time. The aisles were nearly empty, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead while an employee restocked shelves at the end of the row. You remember absent-mindedly reaching for a frozen dinner when an old song suddenly started playing through the store speakers. A song you had not heard in years. Immediately it pulled you back into memories you had spent months trying to emotionally untangle. For a second the loneliness returned all at once. You thought about the person connected to those memories. The plans you built around them. The future you once imagined so clearly. But then something unexpected happened again. Instead of only feeling sadness, you suddenly remembered how emotionally small you felt during the final months of that connection. How often you silenced your own intuition to avoid conflict. How exhausted you became trying to earn reassurance that should have come naturally. And standing there in the middle of that empty grocery aisle, you realized you had been grieving the idea of what you hoped things could become more than the reality of what they truly were. That realization hit deeper than you expected because it exposed how often loneliness can disguise unhealthy attachment as love. Suddenly the ending you once called devastating began looking more like an interruption that arrived before your spirit disappeared completely inside a life that was never sustainable for you. That does not mean the loss stopped hurting immediately. Some nights still feel painfully quiet. There are still moments when your mind reaches backward automatically toward familiar memories because uncertainty remains uncomfortable. But something important has started shifting now. You no longer feel completely abandoned inside the silence. Instead, there are moments where the quiet almost feels intentional. Like your life has been slowing down long enough for you to finally hear truths you kept drowning out with distraction before. That is why you keep noticing subtle moments lately that seem impossible to explain logically. A thought arriving right before you make a bad decision. A sudden feeling warning you not to send a message you would later regret. A sense of peace appearing unexpectedly in moments where panic should have consumed you completely. These moments are easy to dismiss when you are emotionally disconnected from yourself. But once you begin paying attention, they become harder to ignore. Because maybe the presence you thought disappeared from your life never actually left at all. Maybe it simply stopped shouting over the noise and waited for the silence to finally become loud enough for you to notice it again. You are beginning to understand something now that would have sounded impossible to you a year ago. Not everything that left your life was meant to stay, and not everything you lost was truly meant to harm you. Some things disappeared because you were being quietly pulled away before the damage became permanent. That realization keeps returning to you lately in unexpected moments. While driving home in silence. While standing alone in the kitchen after midnight. While staring out windows lost in thought during ordinary afternoons that somehow feel heavier than they should. The truth has been surfacing slowly because if you had seen it all at once before, you probably would not have accepted it. You were too emotionally attached to outcomes you believed would finally heal the loneliness inside you. But now you are starting to see how many of those things were actually built on emotional survival instead of peace. A few nights ago you woke up suddenly around 3 in the morning without understanding why. The apartment was completely still except for the faint sound of rain outside your bedroom window. For a moment you just lay there staring into the darkness while old thoughts started creeping back in again. Questions about your future. Questions about whether you missed your chance at the life you wanted. Questions about why certain doors closed so abruptly after you invested so much emotionally into them. And then your mind drifted back to one specific memory you had not thought about in months. A conversation from long before everything finally fell apart. At the time, you ignored the feeling in your chest because you wanted things to work so badly. But now, replaying the moment honestly, you suddenly recognized how deeply unsettled your spirit already felt back then. The constant anxiety. The emotional instability. The pressure to shrink parts of yourself just to maintain connection. You remembered how exhausted you became trying to preserve something that looked right externally but slowly drained your inner peace. And lying there awake in the darkness, another realization settled over you quietly. If that situation had continued, you would have eventually lost yourself completely trying to hold on to it. That thought shook you because for so long you only focused on the pain of losing it. You never stopped long enough to consider what staying inside it would have eventually cost you emotionally. Suddenly the silence that followed the ending started looking different. The distance. The delays. The isolation. None of it felt random anymore. It felt like interruption. Like something was quietly pulling you away before your exhaustion became permanent. That does not mean the process has been easy. There are still nights where loneliness presses against your chest harder than you know how to explain. There are still moments where uncertainty makes you question everything again. But underneath the confusion, something calmer has slowly started growing inside you too. Awareness. Discernment. A quieter kind of clarity that no longer chases every open door simply because it appears. And maybe that is the real reason your old life has felt increasingly uncomfortable lately. Because you are no longer emotionally asleep in the same ways you used to be. You notice tension faster now. You recognize emptiness sooner. You pay attention when your spirit feels unsettled even if your mind cannot logically explain why yet. That awareness changes the way you move through life. It slows you down. It makes you more careful about what you allow close to your heart. And maybe that is why some things had to break apart before you could finally see them clearly. Because Sometimes protection does not arrive by making your path easier. Sometimes it arrives by making certain doors impossible to walk through until you finally realize they were never leading where your soul truly needed to go. Something inside you has become quieter lately, and strangely, that quietness no longer feels as frightening as it once did. A few months ago, silence felt unbearable because every quiet moment forced you to sit face to face with uncertainty. But now, even though the questions have not all been answered yet, the panic surrounding them has slowly started fading. You still have difficult nights. You still overthink sometimes while driving home with tired eyes and too many thoughts pressing against your mind at once. But there are also moments now where you notice an unfamiliar calm settling into places inside you that used to constantly ache for reassurance. That change did not happen because your circumstances suddenly became perfect. It happened because somewhere along this difficult road, you stopped needing external things to constantly confirm your worth in the same desperate way you once did. You are beginning to understand that peace and certainty are not always the same thing. Some of the calmest moments you have felt recently came during situations where you still had no idea what would happen next. And that realization has started changing the way you move through your life. A few evenings ago you took a different route home from work without really planning to. The sun was beginning to set, casting long orange light across quiet neighborhoods while people watered lawns and kids rode bicycles down the sidewalks. You rolled the windows down slightly, and for the first time in a very long while, your thoughts were not racing ahead trying to fix your future. You were simply present. That moment only lasted a few minutes, but it stayed with you afterward because it felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. You realized how long it had been since your spirit felt still without immediately needing distraction. That stillness matters more than you know because it reveals something important about the person you are becoming. The version of you that entered this season was emotionally dependent on outcomes for stability. If things worked out, you felt hopeful. If doors closed, your entire sense of direction collapsed with them. But slowly, through all the waiting and confusion and unexpected endings, something stronger has been developing underneath the surface. Not hardness. Not emotional numbness. Discernment. The ability to recognize when something looks appealing externally but quietly steals your peace internally. You notice it now in subtle ways. Conversations that once pulled you into anxiety immediately feel easier to step away from. Situations that used to tempt you emotionally no longer hold the same power over you. Even your loneliness feels different lately. It is still there sometimes, especially during quiet nights when old memories drift back unexpectedly. But it no longer completely controls your decisions the way it once did. That change did not come easily. It came through disappointment. Through silence. Through long stretches of uncertainty where you were forced to sit with yourself honestly instead of constantly reaching outward for comfort. And maybe that is why your life had to slow down the way it did. Because if everything you wanted had arrived immediately, you might never have recognized how many of your old desires were rooted in fear of being alone rather than genuine peace. That truth can feel uncomfortable at first, but it is also freeing. Because once you stop chasing things purely to escape loneliness, you begin seeing your life more clearly. You stop forcing connections that drain you. You stop reopening doors that only lead back to exhaustion. And little by little, your spirit starts trusting the quiet guidance inside you again. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But enough to realize that maybe this entire season was never about losing your way. Maybe it was about teaching you how to stop abandoning yourself every time life became uncertain. You spent so much time believing the goal was to get your old life back that you almost missed what this season was actually trying to teach you. For months you measured healing by whether certain doors reopened, whether certain people returned, whether delayed plans finally worked out the way you originally imagined. But little by little, something deeper has been unfolding underneath all of that. You are no longer the same person who first entered this period of waiting. At first that realization scared you because change often feels like losing pieces of yourself before it feels like becoming someone new. But lately, you have started noticing that some of the things you once desperately wanted no longer carry the same emotional hold over you. Not because you became cold. Not because you stopped caring. But because your spirit finally grew tired of confusing emotional attachment with genuine peace. A few nights ago you found yourself sitting on the floor of your apartment after midnight with old boxes spread around you while cleaning out a closet you had avoided touching for months. Receipts. Photographs. Random little reminders of different seasons of your life. At one point you picked up something that instantly pulled you back into memories you once thought you would never emotionally recover from losing. And for a moment the sadness returned again. Not overwhelming, but familiar. You sat there quietly letting the memories move through your mind while rain tapped softly against the windows outside. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling consumed by regret, you suddenly felt compassion for the version of yourself who survived those seasons. You realized how hard you were trying back then just to feel loved, safe, certain, chosen. You saw how often you ignored your own inner warnings because you were terrified of disappointment. And sitting there in that quiet apartment surrounded by pieces of your past, you understood something that changed the way you viewed your entire journey. The real transformation was never about getting everything you lost returned to you exactly as it was before. It was about becoming someone who no longer abandons themselves in order to keep temporary comfort. That truth settled into you slowly but deeply. Because if those old versions of your life had remained untouched, you might never have confronted the loneliness, fear, and emotional dependency hiding underneath your constant need for reassurance. You might never have learned how to sit quietly with yourself without immediately reaching for distraction. You might never have recognized how many of your choices were driven by fear of being alone rather than genuine alignment with your peace. That is why this season had to unfold the way it did. Not to destroy your hope, but to rebuild your relationship with yourself from a more honest place. And suddenly so many things make sense now that once felt unbearably confusing. The silence. The delays. The emotional distance from old environments. None of it was random punishment. It was preparation happening quietly beneath the surface of your life while you thought everything was only falling apart. Even now there are still unanswered questions ahead of you. There are still moments where uncertainty feels uncomfortable. But something inside you no longer panics the same way it used to. Because for the first time in a very long while, your sense of peace is no longer completely dependent on whether life unfolds exactly according to your plans. And maybe that is the deeper meaning behind everything you have survived recently. Maybe the greatest thing this difficult season gave you was not the removal of loneliness or pain, but the ability to finally recognize your own worth even during moments where nothing external was validating it yet. Tonight feels different to you, even if you cannot fully explain why yet. Nothing dramatic changed outside your window. Your phone still carries unanswered questions. Your future still contains uncertainties you cannot completely see through. The same apartment walls surround you. The same responsibilities will still be waiting in the morning. And yet something inside you has softened in a way that would have been impossible only a few months ago. You are no longer fighting the silence with the same desperation. You are no longer chasing every closed door trying to force it open again. Somewhere along this difficult journey, you began understanding that not every unanswered question requires immediate resolution in order for peace to exist. That realization arrived quietly. Not through a breakthrough moment everyone else could see, but through hundreds of small invisible moments that slowly reshaped your spirit from the inside out. Through lonely drives home after exhausting days. Through sleepless nights where your thoughts felt heavier than your body. Through mornings where you got out of bed even when your heart still carried uncertainty. You survived all of it, even during the moments you believed you were emotionally falling apart. And maybe that is what you are finally beginning to recognize now. You were never as abandoned as you feared you were. There was always something quietly holding you together even during the seasons where you felt completely disconnected from hope. A few nights from now, you will probably still sit quietly in your kitchen after midnight sometimes. You will probably still think about old memories unexpectedly while washing dishes or driving familiar roads. There may still be moments where loneliness briefly returns and tries convincing you that you are behind in life somehow. But those moments no longer carry the same power over you they once did. Because now, underneath the uncertainty, there is awareness. You know what it feels like to ignore your own peace in order to keep temporary comfort alive. You know what emotional exhaustion feels like when you continue forcing yourself into situations your spirit quietly wants to leave behind. And most importantly, you know now that silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes silence is simply space being created so something deeper inside you can finally be heard. Earlier this evening, while standing near your window watching distant headlights move slowly through the rain outside, you felt something you have not felt in a long time. Not certainty exactly. Not sudden answers. Just a calm awareness that your life is still unfolding even here. even now. Even inside the unanswered parts. And maybe that feeling matters more than immediate clarity ever could. Because peace that only exists when everything goes according to plan is fragile. But the kind of peace slowly growing inside you now has survived disappointment, waiting, confusion, loneliness, and silence. That kind of peace changes a person permanently. It teaches you how to remain open-hearted without abandoning yourself. It teaches you how to trust quiet instincts over desperate emotions. It teaches you that some of the hardest seasons of your life were not evidence that you were forgotten, but evidence that you were being guided away from places that could never truly hold your soul safely long-term. So tonight, you do not need to force answers out of the future. You do not need to rush yourself into certainty. You do not need to reopen doors that closed for reasons you are only beginning to understand now. For the first time in a very long while, it is enough to simply breathe deeply, let the quiet exist without fear, and recognize that even during the seasons where you felt the most alone, something greater than your confusion was still quietly leading you forward the entire time.